Everyone loves a handy tote bag. So I've marked the layout I need. I know how I need to lay the fabric. I know how I need to lay the pattern. And it's very important that you lay the pattern according to the pattern layout, because it will show you what direction to put the piece in, so you'll follow a grain line if there's a grain line on the pattern. Next step is to cut out the pattern tissue. This pattern calls for interfacing all over the wrong side of the fabric, and you must make sure that interface bonds properly if you're using the fusible interfacing. And to do that, you need to use a press cloth to protect the fabric and the interfacing, and then press with a hot iron for a good 10 seconds in each position before lifting the iron and moving it along. Make sure it's well bonded and it can't come away, and then leave it to cool for half an hour or so, just so it's completely cool before you start sewing with it. Otherwise, again, it can lift off, and if it lifts off, it can bubble. Particularly important when you're using interfacing on dressmaking and you're going to have to wash it, because once it bubbles, you can't get it back. I've pinned the webbing on, and I'm going to stitch down each of the long edges. So the webbing is pinned according to the pattern piece. So always keep your pattern pieces folded with the fabric until you're ready to sew, because then if you need to refer back to them, you always can. I've moved the needle over to the far right so that I can stitch along the edge of the webbing using the presser foot as my guide. And this time I've used the inner edge of the metal part of the foot as the guide. So it means I can sew nice and close to that edge quite easily because I've got that visual guide. I don't sew to the very end of this because I'm going to attach the lining and then I'm going to put a trim on. So I'm only going to sew, as according to a pattern, to about 5 inches from the end. So I've double pinned to remind me to stop. And then just back stitch there to lock those stitches in. And that's that side done. And I go back, move the needle over to the far left to stitch down that edge, and again using the edge of the presser foot as my guide. And then to finish off, I've already done this side, but I've lapped the 2 ends because this handle goes all the way round. I've lapped the 2 ends so that the raw edge is tucked underneath, stitched across where the raw edge is at the bottom, and across here, holding that in. So it's all nice and neat, and that will actually be under the bottom of the bag. The bag base on this pattern is formed by having a cutout section. So that's actually the bottom of the bag. It's one big piece for front and back. So I fold that right sides together, matching those edges, and you can now see it's a little square that's been cut. I'm going to sew the side seams. So I just sew from the top down to here. It's going to take a 1/4 inch seam. So having stitched that seam, I now open out the bag base, and with that side seam in the centre, I'm just going to open the seam allowance to press it and press that open, and then I'm going to stitch across there. I don't need to worry too much about neatening that raw edge, although I can do if the fabric is going to fray a lot. And to neaten the raw edge, I'm just literally going to choose a zigzag stitch and sew again on the edge of the fabric so that half of the stitch, the right hand half of the stitch, falls off the edge of the fabric. And that'll just neaten that raw edge and prevent it from fraying. Not necessary if your fabric doesn't fray easily, but a good idea if it does. And the reason it's not necessary if it doesn't fray easily is because it's going to have a lining, so it'll be encased within the lining anyway. So I'll do exactly the same on the other side of the bag. Make sure that those handles, of course, are tucked way out of the way. and so the other side seam and the other bag base. Bag base is now done. As you can see, it's sort of squared off. So I'm going to turn this through to the right side. And then I'm ready to make the lining. And I make the lining exactly the same way. Just poke out those corners. So that's ready. I set that to one side while I make the lining. Now the lining is done in exactly the same way as I've just said. So again, I've got the bag base, but the only difference is I've left a turning gap in one of the side edges, because I'm now going to put the main bag inside the lining. So the main bag is right side out. The lining bag is right side in. So in other words, the right sides go together. Pop it inside, tuck the handles in and out of the way, and then match the sides and the fronts. So I'm matching those seams and pin, and again I'm going to press those seam allowances open. I'll just unpin that. That's why I didn't stitch right to the top of those webbings, so that they can be kept out of the way, because the next step is to stitch all the way around the top edge. So I'm going to stitch all the way around. I've taken off the flatbed from the machine so that I can sort of stitch in the round and it comes around nice and easily. So just getting back to the beginning, overlap the stitching a little bit, reverse to lock in the stitching, and then that's ready. So I'm now going to just go around and trim that seam all the way round to neaten it up and neaten the edges up. I've already started a bit, here we go. So I'm going to pull it through the opening, and then what will happen is the bag lining will be turned right side out, and the bag will also be right side out. And this is when you then go to the ironing board and press, so to make sure that the lining is pushed inside the bag and that seam is nicely on that edge. So I'm going to roll it like that, and then on the ironing board press with maybe even the tiniest bit turn to the inside like that, just to make sure that the lining doesn't come out at all. I'm now going to top stitch around the top with this nice contrast ribbon, and I'm going to move the needle over to the right as far as I can, use the edge of the presser foot along the edge of the bag fabric so that I can stitch in a nice straight line along the edge of the trim. And here I've got 2 pins in because I've actually tucked the raw edge of the overlap underneath, so that's neatened that raw edge. So I've just whipped that pin out now, ready to pull the next pin out. I'm just holding it gently and now pulling it out. So that's keeping that folded edge under. I'm just going to do the same again along the other side of the ribbon trim, moving the needle over to the left, using the stitch width button or dial to move the needle. You can do that on most machines, and you can only do it when you're using a straight stitch, because then the stitch width button has that dual function. So I'm back to the beginning of that stitching. I'm just going to overlap it very slightly to lock in the stitching. And then on this machine, stitch on the spot. And then I can cut the threads close to the stitching. And the last thing to do with that trim, there's a little gap where I folded under the edge, so I'm just going to stitch down that edge. You can do that by hand if you prefer, just so that that little fold is nice and neatly stitched in place. So the last step on the bag is to bring the handles back up in position and to continue stitching along both long edges to the top so that they're anchored nicely to the top. And even for added strength, another thing you could do is do a cross stitch at the top there if you wanted. There's my bag all finished. Now, one other thing that it says to do in the pattern is to cut a piece of cardboard for the width of the base, cover it with some spare lining fabric, so you just glue it to the cardboard and pop that in and it'll give a more solid base. And the other thing you could do if you wanted to is add a magnetic clasp to keep the top edges together, but you would do that before you finish putting the lining in.